Clifford E. Carnicom was born Clifford Bruce Stewart in Jacksonville, Florida, in January of 1953 to Alexander Stewart and Elizabeth Zuzak. Early in his life, he would be adopted along with his two older brothers and another child by Francis Eugene and Kathleen Carnicom. Clifford's father spent 30 years in the Navy and rose from the enlisted ranks to become an officer. His mother was a homemaker until he was 11 years old, when she became involved, along with the rest of the family, in the family restaurant business in California. Prior to moving to California, the family moved fairly frequently based on Mr. Carnicom's naval deployments, which were primarily on the East Coast. Clifford described the family environment as military-like, where strong discipline, ethics, and duty were stressed and where emotions were underplayed. Mr. Carnicom received 30 days leave a year for vacation, which were spent camping, which Clifford fondly remembers and which helped to foster a lifelong love and respect for nature. Clifford went through the public school system, where he applied himself with diligence. He went on to get an Associate of Arts in Science, a vocational degree in forest engineering, and a BS in engineering, with an emphasis on surveying and photogrammetry. He spent time with the Forest Service, Department of Defense, and Bureau of Land Management. When with the Department of Defense, he was afforded the opportunity to fulfill graduate studies in geodetic science at The Ohio State University and Washington State University in St. Louis. Geodetic science uses applied physics and math to study the geometry, orbital mechanics, and gravitational fields of the Earth. After finishing his service with the various government agencies over a span of 12 years, he went on to establish his own computer consultancy business, which he pursued for another 17 years. Clifford has described his life as consisting of 4 vocations: education, public service, private consultancy, and research. We begin this video with Clifford commenting on the role of education and learning in his life as foundational to his unique skill set, mindset, and commitment that underlie the 20 years of revolutionary research he recently completed that defines the most significant challenge facing humans and this planet.
I actually never was motivated by performing well for others, though. I had a very strong interest in the educational process from the beginning, and for reasons, what I would call reasons of purity of purpose. My reason for education in my life was to learn. My reason for education was not to become respected or worthy of somebody's praise. I valued the process, still do, an extremely important part of my life. And as I went into adulthood in the end, I spent about 10 years in the educational system. Again, making rather critical decisions about what the purpose of that education was for me. I had opportunities to pursue titles attached to my name, but underneath the entire process was my drive to know, to learn, and curiosity. And that took me to places of great importance in my studies. When I completed the formal part of my academic years, I left with a couple of strong impressions. And one of them was that I learned on several occasions that those that were in the position where it was presumed that they had full mastery and knowledge of a particular discipline or subject, that I learned that I had questions that they were unable to answer or chose not to answer. So I learned the thresholds and the limit that was inherent within the educational system, even though theoretically it was the purported throne of expertise, if that makes sense. And the other impression I left with at the end of this period was that it came down to the understanding that if there was a problem that was important enough to me, if I deemed that problem to be important enough for me to solve, that I would do it. And those were a couple of important things that I left with from that educational system. But what I would regard as a process of independence, required independence of thought, I guess, is how I would describe it. That required independence of the thought process was established quite firmly at the end of my graduate schooling, along with my decisions to leave the Department of Defense, because it was necessary for me to be able to operate independently in my life to accomplish that which I knew was ultimately the most important. Now, I didn't know where that would actually lead to, but I knew that I required independence, both ability to perform and to reach my own analyses, I guess is what it would amount to.
It's taken up about 20 years of your life, most recent. Was that done concurrently with your computer business?
It was. That's how it started. Yes, absolutely. I had the private business, and then I started doing the work basically any time that I had. They were very full days. They always were very full days. But yes, they were two entirely separate full enterprises in my life that were operating parallel for quite some time.
So as we approach this last 20 years, what I'm hearing from you is that you grew up in a disciplined house with a strong sense of ethics, that you had a love for nature, because from what you've told me, you actually did camping and so on.
Much deeper than has actually been expressed.
Okay. That you had a passion for learning.
Very true.
That you had an independent spirit, and that you had a very interesting skill set which combined science, engineering, math.
Yeah, it's very true, and actually, it's actually in some ways even broader than that in terms of how my mind works, because I started out college years as an art student. Okay. There's another side to my life also that is not expressed within the what I would call the rigid, structured approach that we might perceive embodies me entirely. It's not my entire life. There are other ways that the world is perceived, and I can certainly say that art and music have certainly been the arts. The arts and the emotions are very much a part of our lives and should be.
So it seems like both hemispheres of the brain are working pretty well.
I feel quite comfortable, I guess I would say. I feel quite comfortable.
You told me once that you own an interesting book. I think the title is Everything That You Thought You Knew Was Wrong. But you said you never needed to read the book. You got the message from the cover. Can you just expound on that for a second?
Well, that's true. So there are times when an important phrase says what needs to be said, because the title forces one, if they are willing to set yourself aside for a second and ask about your entire framework of existence, everything that you think is, quote, true. If you're willing, it allows you to step back from that and ask, what is that actually based upon? What is that assumption or presumption of truth actually based upon? Now, we'll also find, if we dig into the nitty-gritty there, that Henry David Thoreau, was a big influence on my life in terms of the thought process. And he made a statement in his life, and he said something like, no way of thinking or doing can be trusted without proof. Now, that's not a very exciting statement that he actually made, but that statement is so deep and so true in terms of living that statement. If you live what he said, that means one is to question everything and question it fairly and honestly. And that's really the process that book is simply unfolding. It's simply saying, you need to be willing to ask what your presumption of truth is based upon.
So one day, some 20 years ago, you look up in the sky and you notice something. I guess that's a big part of inquiry, to actually notice things. And what did you see that made you wonder what was going on?
The truth is, the start of that process, it can be answered if you're willing to look. It was answered within a 40-minute period. 20 minutes covered most of it, but it was answered within a 40-minute period if you're simply willing to just look honestly at what happens. And what happens in a representative case in there is that you have a transformation of the atmosphere. Again, I get technical because I have the technical side. You have a physical transformation of the state of the atmosphere take place within 20 to 40 minutes. And how does it take place? It takes place with the introduction of an abnormal number of aircraft performing certain actions and maneuvers in a systematic way over the very region which is transformed. Okay? When it walks like a duck and acts like a duck and whatever it quacks like a duck, it is a duck. But the origin is that our physical world was being altered in a systematic, deliberate way without the involvement or consent of the public at large, which is being subjected to this. And this is the dispersal of physical material. In the end, it's not a game and it's not something imaginary. You have this dispersal of foreign physical material into the atmosphere. And now, no matter what other discussions you wish to take, it doesn't matter what it is. If it's foreign and it's material, it's a problem. Okay? And it was a problem from the very beginning. And it has been a problem, and it's still a problem, and it's got us in a whole lot deeper into the question, does it exist or does it not exist? We're in a whole lot deeper than that by now, folks.
So some people refer to this phenomenon as chemtrails. That's not something you refer to it as.
I don't use that term because if I'm trying to communicate with somebody, it's like we have rules. We have standards. We have rules. My standards in my life are I'm subject to the courtroom of life. My whole life I regard as a courtroom in terms of if I need to convince you of something, I need to use something that we can agree on. And I understand there's popular terminology for things, but I also know that language is used and designed and created also and engineered to manipulate people. Language is an incredibly powerful force of manipulation and perception. A single word can completely color a person's perception of an entire state of affairs. So I'm aware of that. And I simply say, I'm not playing that game. We'll play the game of the courtroom, and we got to pull out the dictionary. If we have a question, pull out the dictionary. And I'm sorry, chemtrail is one of the terms that causes some problems, along with some other terms that cause problems. And the technical terms that are satisfactory for the issue will be that of pollution. You can start out with pollution. You can be there simple. You can be using aerosols. You can be using particulates. It actually gets more involved than that because it goes beyond that. At some point, guess what? You get to throw in there biologicals. You get to throw in there. You get to throw in there submicron structures, okay? In this case, filament samples. So, but it's physical material is the issue, okay? And the size of it will be important. And those are some terms that are satisfactory. Yes, I do not use the word chemtrails. I don't use the term persistent contrails because they don't satisfy the requirements of the conditions.
Let's take a short detour, and some people that you know and I know and that we respect have said that the term chemtrail actually came originally from the Air Force to describe this phenomenon. There was a document titled Chemtrails, but what you told me was it was actually a chemistry textbook.
Sure. So
just a chemistry textbook, and it was more like the journey in chemistry. That's what the trail part of it meant. Is that correct?
It's absolutely my interpretation. All right. So the skinny is the Air Force produces a book. They actually produced a series of them, apparently. As I once said, if you actually want to be fair, you go to the opposing arguments. You look at the opposing arguments in the process to try to find out if you're being fair about what you're doing. In that process of looking at opposing arguments, you will find indeed there are Air Force documents that use that particular term. Again, I despise the term, but they use that term. And then that term chemtrail, and they will claim that this is the basis of, what we're talking about. What I'm saying is if you look at that no matter what is claimed by other people, if you look at that document, it's a standard chemistry textbook, okay, in chemistry. The chapter outlined is identical to any standard text. There is no mysterious language and allusion to future projects 20 years in the future. It's a straightforward, fundamental chemistry textbook. And the fact that it has that name, let's say, okay, there is this word coincidence that applies sometimes, okay? And at this point, my opinion, again, others may have another, my opinion is you have a coincident terminology that is being manipulated and used in a way that doesn't make any sense or has no basis in reality, okay? And that the term, if you actually look into the origin of the term that is used, it has a much more interesting history, okay, of how it appears spontaneously in a media setting that is given a great deal of attention, an unlikely amount of attention given to that term in a media presentation in a way that did not serve that purpose of fulfillment and pursuit of truth. But I would say names of interest that people should be willing to look at would be, you'd look at an individual by the name of Jay Reynolds. I don't try to do things publicly unless somebody has the right to represent themselves. But there is a record of investigation that if you're curious enough, you can make. You can look at the influence of an individual named Jay Reynolds, and you can look at the influence of an individual by the name of William Thomas, purportedly a journalist, the other person purportedly an aviation mechanic or something in that field. I'm hesitant to include names because they're not necessary in my book, but what their influence is very much necessary to represent.
It shows to me, and I hope the world, the sense of fair play that you come with in the very, very strong ethical sense. So I appreciate you explaining the answer the way that you have.
Well, see, we've never had the courtroom. This is one of the problems. The courtroom has never been called. And in the courtroom, everyone is to present their evidence. We have no courtroom.
So I'd like to hear your evidence now for 20 years of research. And in one talk that you gave a couple years ago in Santa Fe, you mentioned that finally, from your perspective, the link between geoengineering and bioengineering has been made obvious. So maybe with that context, you can start.
When we start bringing in terms bioengineering, this is like another whole world, and nobody's even talking about that in the sense it needs to be talked. So you have this evolution from the early years of the research into this term called geoengineering. A little bit more suitable and appropriate, okay? Which would mean you're changing the earth, right? You're changing the earth by designing systems, human systems. That's what you're trying to do. And yes, that's very much in place. Absolutely. Now, a lot of people have been rather comfortable with adopting that idea that, I bet they are doing something like that. They could be doing something like that. But you don't see too many people that have really entered the arena of bioengineering until more recently. That's changing now. Okay, you get about a 10-year lag at least before things really get any kind of attention that they're due. So that's coming into the fore a little bit better. But in all the years that people were trying to settle out whether or not our world has been screwed up, physically or not, particularly with the atmosphere, they weren't talking about bioengineering. Okay.
There is a website, carnicominstitute.org, that serves as an archive of the work that you've done for the last 20 years. It includes videos, it includes video of interviews, videos of lectures, but also is an archive of some 400 research papers that you've done over the last 20 years. So some 22 years, you look up in the sky, you see the phenomenon that you've described, aerosols being dispersed, that's transforming the atmosphere before your eyes. Where did you go from there?
You go from there, you enter a process. You enter a process of logic, deduction, science, observation, analysis, and you step yourself through there. And the difficulty here is that you're dealing with a problem that, first of all, it's immense. It's immense. It actually it circles the globe. It's an immense problem. And there is no formal acknowledgement of any type in any way that this is actually a situation or a problem. Not in any kind of formal way. And so you truly are on your own. Now, you can be on your own and make a fuss about it and make noise, and all that needs to be done. In fact, a whole lot of noise in ways that need to be done was never done. My way to make noise was to start asking the basic questions. And those basic questions, and I've mentioned this in the lecture or the talk, really it wasn't a lecture, the talk before, like the 5 W's are your questions: where, when, why, what, who, right? These are what you're after in life for most anything, if you need to know about it. And I went to work on those with a particular, it was appropriate for me to place the majority of my attention on the what, right? The when and the where come into the picture. The why is in there. It gets harder to work with, but the why gets in there. The who is the one that I had no access to. Okay? So you've got the 5 fundamental things that need to be done. I pursued to some level and degree 4 of those. One of them with a great deal of emphasis being the what. What is actually physically happening here, okay? And eventually at the analytic side, to the best of my ability. Again, I'm a citizen. What do I have, right? The who, we have to leave that one. I have to leave it to the side. Everyone loves that one. They want it first. But I'm sorry, that one, I did not have access to that. Still do not have access to it directly. It's always indirect for us right now. In fact, that's the very reason we remain here with this problem. It's because we don't have the who. Okay, we never had it. So you cannot get the courtroom going if you don't have the who, right? But that record of 20 years, which the focus of it is those 400 papers of research, I would say those papers represent a very methodical, systematic, disciplined pursuit of those 4 elements with a very dominant thread of the what. And the what, we can get into as much detail as we want here, but the what eventually means at the molecular level, to the best of my ability, right? That's what it means.
Tell us a little bit about the tools that you used and were able to acquire to do this type of analysis of the what.
There were no resources whatsoever. I didn't have funds and resources for anything like this. But I did what I could. And the mind is a powerful thing. And tools are nice, but the mind is a very powerful thing. So you do the best you can. And so I had nothing to start with. I operated out of a bedroom. But doesn't take too much to get a few beakers together and, a Bunsen burner and microscope. It doesn't take too much to get something going where you can start learning something. And I did that right away. Let's just say within probably less than a year, I was at the point where I was submitting physical evidence to the director of the Environmental Protection Agency, Carol M. Browner, asking her for an explanation of what it was that I was seeing and recording.
How were you collecting this stuff?
Well, any way that I could. You basically, what do you have? You have air, you have water, primarily rain, and you have soil, right? Air, water, soil. And the Greeks say had fire in there or something, right? But you go after everything that you have access to, and so you start collecting environmental sampling. Classic environmental science, and then the tools did advance slowly over the years, far too slowly, but they did advance over the years. And by the latter stages of the work, I had some respectable equipment. I had infrared spectroscopy was my mainstay. I was working at the molecular level of investigation. I had a good quality microscope. It was still piecemeal. I mean, it was nothing compared to what was needed, but I had enough to make the case. The work becomes quite profound and fundamental in its advanced stages, and you're dealing with microbiology and the isolation of the word you would use is novel microorganism, and you're identifying, you're isolating that microorganism, you're culturing it. These are huge things. These things are, when I say these words, these are years of work. Separation into biomolecules, and then eventually extraction of the DNA.
Okay, so hold on a second, because you just made a giant leap for mankind.
I suppose.
Because we went from stuff that people think of as materials to biology. So at some point you realized that there were certain elements, I guess you might say, that were being dispersed, right? Chemicals. But there was also a biological agent. So I want you to spend a little bit more time explaining that transition.
Well, it's worthy of it, and I only made a brief reference to what was the turning point in that. And this involves the Environmental Protection Agency. This was a very important event that took place. It took place early in the game. If you look at it, it's about 2000. It would have been 1999, 2000. There was an interaction with the Environmental Protection Agency, which was crucial at the time, and it has remained crucial. That's the thing. The thing is, that has never, ever gone away, what happened there. Because what happened there was this particular sample, not only did it have interesting physical properties that would present it as a hazard to the environment, namely, you don't want to be breathing solids, particularly of a filament nature. You don't want to be breathing that in the atmosphere. This is what asbestos was all about. You're going to be eager to go breathe your brake pads, You don't want that in the air, right? But what happened here was that I also encountered and identified the existence of, let's call them, again, novel biological elements and structures within that sample. Now, this is a game changer at this point, okay? Because you're in a whole different arena. You start, you try and make an allegory of asbestos fiber or something. You can get away with that for a little bit. But you start introducing biology internal to that structure of unknown origin in the environment. You have a whole new ball game going on. Well, you have a crossover between several different sample types. The The metals are there. I had one extremely high level investigative analysis test done for metallic analysis. Those metals are there.
What metals?
There's a dozen with a very high level process testing that I have. So that's there. Okay. And then my work, working at a more basic level, was showing the presence of metallic salts. There's an overlap between all these things, but metallic salts are a way that a person could get access to things more easily, because you can conduct, tests. You can conductivity, this type of thing, evaporation. You can conduct tests and get to those. So I had metallic salts showing up early. Now, where would that be? Rainwater would be a classic case, right? That would be like a classic sample type you'd working with. But the filaments are a discrete physical object. Separate from this, not non-soluble, right? Non-soluble. Quote, appearance of a spider web, okay? And that game's another game that you won't win at. Sorry, folks, they're not spider webs, but that's a separate discussion, okay? But it's within the filaments where I was able to see that there were biological structures within those, okay? Now, I also ran atmospheric samples where I also acquired biological elements. It's a matter if you knew what you were looking for, you have a base. But we're talking about any type of environmental sample that I would be able to get a hold of as a citizen scientist to look at it in every way possible. In fact, you would see my work is you go at it as many ways as you possibly can. These filaments are a whole different ballgame, because first of all, they were presented to the Environmental Protection Agency in all fairness and honest manner of saying, I think that these could be a hazard to the environment. Please identify them, right? Please identify their nature. And their refusal raised up some really serious flags, okay? Because what did they say? What they said was, we have no obligation to identify any unsolicited material. This was an incredibly troublesome phrase to me, and still is. Because go look at the mission statement of the Environmental Protection Agency. Go figure out what they're supposed to be about, okay? And you tell me you're going to accept the highest level, the administrator position, coming back to you saying, we don't have to do anything. We don't have to do anything from you unless I ask for it. Me being now the administrator of the EPA. I don't have to touch anything you present to me unless I ask you for it. Sorry, that's wrong. That's where the courtroom needed to be. Never was. Courtroom never. And that action, I knew that it was of high impact and implications and consequence at that point. It has remained so. It's more so every day of my life. Summary statements are that all evidence shows that this living entity, you could call it bacterial-like if you're trying to describe it. You'd want to think of something as a bacterial nature. I'm technical again, so you're talking of something at submicron level in this case, so it's even a very small bacterial-like form. I gave a term to it because of the lack of attention after a great appeal of cross-domain bacteria. It has many, many interesting aspects to it. However, the summary statement would be that all evidence indicates or points to the fact that this particular microorganism now affects all life on this planet in a detrimental fashion. That would be the summary statement. So that should give us something to wonder about. How the heck is he saying something like that?
Could we summarize by saying that there were some roadblocks put in in the way?
I've had several roadblocks in my life. I do what is within my means and what I know is proper and necessary to do. I have attempted to submit the sample that requires identification. I am telling the entire world that you have the means to produce that sample available. You have the obligation and requirement to perform that process of sequencing this DNA and establishing the genetic origin without dispute. Okay, and then you can start asking, what exactly is the nature, origin, and purpose of this particular microorganism in our world? What is its role?
As we're getting to the end of this discussion, there is this astonishing link between something that has been described as Morgellons, which every time you use that word you put in quotes, which I want you to explain why. But that refers most often to a skin disease where certain filaments protrude through the skin, along with perhaps some other weird creatures. And what you found, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the filaments that you extracted from the samples of air and soil and water over the years were identical matches to those filaments that are part of a syndrome described as Morgellons. So is that true?
You have summarized and you have stated the truth of the matter very well. This is exactly the case. In our earlier discussion, I focused on the environmental aspect and the failure of one of our agencies to act from an environmental standpoint. But yes, the evolution of the work reaches the conclusion that there is an identical match to any level that was within my means. Again, operating at the molecular level to a pretty sophisticated degree. Infrared spectroscopy is not just a little toy. It is our window into one of our most accessible windows into understanding the chemical and biological structure of things. All of the research over extended period of time, years of work, hundreds and hundreds of infrared analyses and chemical analyses, chromatography, a dozen methods. They say that the constitution, chemically and structurally, of the environmental filaments as they were first discovered over 20 years ago are identical in nature to those that are repeatedly evident and present within many humans. When we start bringing up the term Morgellons, and we do have a story of why I would use quotes for that, but I would also have to stress that this microbiology is not confined to just a filament structure. It is an entire body of metabolic growth, a whole series of structures, okay? It's no different than you. What are you composed of, okay? Everything's composed of four main things, I'll put it that way: proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. So all life is of these four things, but you look a lot different than a dog does. And even a Chihuahua looks a lot different than a Great Dane does. And that's because everything gets to change within those biomolecules, right? But they come down to those four. But everything says that we have a biological match between these at the environmental and the filament level in the skin. But what I'm also leading to is there is an entire body of associated microbiology that is in addition to and surrounds the filament growth. The filament is just one manifestation of growth. There is a whole body of metabolic products that are produced the same as you produce skin and you produce teeth and you produce hair and eyeballs, right? Same thing is going on with this microorganism. And this is reflected throughout the body in many, many ways. And it's this notion that I just have a few people with some kind of skin problem, that is not at all the reality of what we are to speak of. We may not have had time to speak of it, but we're talking about a microbiology that is omnipresent, pervasive. And to me, thus far, all biology is showing it, and it's throughout the entire biology, the entire living being, in many, many, many ways.
The entire biosphere.
everything says we have something that has all. Okay, the summary statement, just as I talked about, I said the atmosphere had been altered. Okay, early game, simple conclusion. Summary statement, entire biology of the entire planet. All evidence, again, says that it has been transformed by this particular microbiology that a good share of my life has been devoted to.
So you have this filament, but then when it is introduced into an organism, it transforms itself and it causes other transformations of the body.
Yeah, this is what is discovered in the culturing process. The culturing process, when it is successful, shows one what the metabolic products are. And then those metabolic products can be further analyzed. And then this is where the DNA will come from, is when you have sufficient biological material to work with. But there's an entire body of different types of metabolic growth that take place, and the filament is just one.
So to summarize, you look up in the sky and you say, what is that, primarily? Because that's the question, answering the what, that can give you the most information given your tools, given circumstances. And you spend 20 years looking at the what. And you find out that in addition to these elements, there are salts, but also of greatest interest is that there are these filaments that contain biology. And further looking, you determine that this biological agent has basically invaded every aspect of the biosphere that you could look at. And every time that you look, you see that it creates havoc. So just in closing, explain some of the havoc that this filament is providing for life on this planet.
I would actually have to describe it as an assault on almost every front you could think of. I mean, there's so many things that I don't know about, but on most any front I can think of, it looks like you've got an assault that's taking place. So let's start simple, and you can start working through the entire body, and you're going to run into a problem almost anywhere you go. But let's start simple and fundamental, and also large scale and profound. Iron is a nutrient source, and a very important nutrient source. Now, I get to mention something in your body, and I'm hoping you might just all of us be able to guess about, that's in our body that's really important, that involves iron. And if you don't have the luxury of answering it, the answer is your blood. The answer is your blood. Your blood requires iron. Okay. Now, how important do you want something to be? I can go on for a dozen other things. We'll start talking about your body and all the ways that this can be affecting you. But how much do you need to start with? And I'm saying you have everything in the world that you need to understand you've got a problem. You've got a really serious problem if you have a microorganism in your body. The simplest way of saying it would be that it's competing, utilizing, absconding the iron in your body for its purposes. But do we know what a parasite is? That which steals energy from another. I'm telling you that the function of iron in your body, which I'm going to mention, is the utilization of oxygen. Because I'm telling you that there is a prevalent microorganism that is interfering with the iron utilization of your body, which is therefore affecting the oxygen utilization of your body, which is therefore affecting the entire energy cycle of your body. Okay? Entire. Again, I say, how much do you need? I'm saying that's enough. Okay? That's enough to work with, and we can go on and on from there.